Thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, Denmark, Poland and Russia saw the chance to put an end to the Swedish Empire by attacking simultaneously when Karl XI had died young and been replaced on the throne by his inexperienced son, who was still a teenager. It didn't work out quite the way they had expected though. Under the leadership of Karl XII, the Swedes crushed first the Danes, then the Russians and last the Poles. Karl XII went as far as to depose the King of Poland and replaced him with a puppet of his choosing. The young King of Sweden had proven his worth and defended his kingdom. He could have returned home a hero, but he was a hothead who also held absolute power, and he decided it wasn't enough to win the war. He was going to absolutely crush those who dared to start a war against him. Today, we'll see how well that played out. Episode 103, The Final Boss. As we saw last time, the Battle of Narva in the year 1700 had been a disaster for Russian military power and a severe blow to Tsar Peter I's plan to expand to the Baltic Sea and create a western port for his empire. But even though the Russians had lost the battle, they hadn't given up on the war. Since Karl XII turned his attention to Augustus II and spent the following years waging war in Poland, Lithuania and Saxony, the Russians had ample time to rebuild their army in preparation for the inevitable showdown with the Swedes. Tsar Peter knew he'd face the Swedes in battle again sooner or later, since his expansionist agenda in the Baltic region clashed with the Swedish expansionist agenda in the same region. And the Russian ruler wanted to make sure that the next time his army would stand face to face with Karl XII, they wouldn't repeat the mistakes from Narva. In the first years of the 18th century, as the Swedish main army was crisscrossing Poland and Saxony hunting for Augustus the Strong, the Russians methodically expanded step by step in the eastern borderlands of the Swedish Empire. Even though the Tsar was working overtime to modernize and to beef up his armed forces, they would still not have stood a chance against the Swedish main army under Karl XII. But he was busy chasing Augustus, and whatever troops the Swedes could throw against the Russian incursions weren't enough to withstand the mounting pressure from the east. At first, the Russians conquered the mouth of the river Neva. There, they demolished the Swedish fortress Nyenskans, and in its place the Tsar founded a new city, St. Petersburg. You might have heard of it. That was in 1703, and the following year the fortress and naval base of Kronstadt was founded on an island in the Gulf of Finland. This stronghold would defend the Tsar's new city, and some 200 years later it would play a key role in the legend of the October Revolution in 1917. But that's the topic for another podcast. The same year as Kronstadt was established, the cities of Narva and Dorpat, modern-day Tartu, in eastern Estonia, fell to the Russians. But the Swedish forces in the Baltic provinces were still not beaten. The Swedish forces, under the command of General Adam Ludwig Levenhaupt, were successfully defending Courland, Livonia, and most of Estonia, hoping the king would finish teaching Augustus the Strong his lesson soon and come and push the Russians out again. In anticipation of the inevitable Swedish attack, Tsar Peter actually offered the King of Sweden a deal. He would return all the lands his armies had conquered from Sweden in the war, with the exception of St. Petersburg and the surrounding land. The Tsar wasn't willing to give up on his window to the west. But Karl XII wasn't interested in any compromise. He wasn't going to let the Russians keep a single inch of territory he'd captured during the current war. He refused Peter's overtures and gave orders to prepare for a full-scale invasion of Russia. It was time to eliminate the last man standing from the original anti-Swedish alliance, time to defeat the final boss. In the fall of 1707, Karl XII left Saxony at the head of the Swedish main army of some 44,000 men. The ultimate goal was to march on Moscow and take the Russian capital, which would force the Russians to surrender. If you have even the most fleeting knowledge of Russian history, warning bells are probably ringing in your head right about now, since Karl XII isn't the only invader who's tried to vanquish the Russians by striking at Moscow. But in the king's defense, he didn't have the warning examples of Napoleon and Hitler as a reference when he made his decision. On Christmas Day 1707, the Swedish main army crossed the Vistula River in Poland, and about a month later, he was back in Grodno. The Russians didn't put up much of a resistance because they were busy dealing with a Cossack rebellion in the Don region further south. The Swedes pressed on all the way to Minsk before they went into winter quarters. Due to the famously poor conditions of the Russian roads, the Swedes were stuck in Minsk until June 1708. Only by then the roads were in good enough condition to handle the passing of an army. It took the Swedes about a month to reach Holovchin, halfway to Smolensk, and there they met organized Russian resistance for the first time. The Swedes won the battle and could continue eastward toward the Dnieper, one of the great rivers that the Vikings had used when traveling to Miklagard 7 centuries before. Even though the forces sent against them were defeated, the march eastward through Tsar Peter's empire was far from a walk in the park. The Russians were using scorched earth tactics, systematically burning everything in front of the advancing Swedish army, forcing the Swedes to rely almost completely on increasingly outstretched and vulnerable supply lines. Eventually, even Karl XII realized he couldn't just go on like this. He wouldn't reach Moscow before winter, so he needed to think of what to do instead. He had a few options, such as returning to Livonia and spend the winter there, or to wait for General Lewenhaupt, who was supposed to link up with the main army, bringing soldiers and supply from Kurland. But King Karl refused to retreat, and Lewenhaupt was taking his sweet time catching up. Not because he was lazy, but because Tsar Peter made sure his army was constantly harassed by Russian troops. So instead, Karl XII decided to turn south into Ukraine. There, he wanted to meet up with the Ukrainian Cossacks under the leadership of Ivan Mazepa, who were in rebellion against Russian rule at the time. Lewenhaupt also turned south, but before he was able to join forces with the main army, the Russians attacked. The Russians chose to attack while the Swedes were crossing a river in eastern Belarus, and Lewenhaupt lost not only half his men in the battle, but also the oh-so-important supply train, with all the supplies the main army needed. Now, the need to find supplies for the Swedish army became even greater, and Karl XII hurried as fast as his troops could move toward Ivan Mazepa's headquarters in the town of Baturin in northern Ukraine. The Russians wanted to stop the Swedes from reaching the town and resupplying, so they hurried there first and sacked the place in early November. In order to make sure the Swedes wouldn't find anything of use there, Baturin was razed to the ground. The population was massacred, and everything that the Russians couldn't carry with them in terms of food, weapons, and ammunition was destroyed. Even though it was now clear that it wasn't going to be a cheerful winter for the Swedish main army, they probably couldn't imagine just how bad it was going to get. The winters in Russia are never particularly pleasant, but that winter has gone down in history as one of the coldest in recorded history. It even has its own name, the Great Frost. In one particular winter storm, the Swedish troops were caught by surprise while out and about, and some 2,000 soldiers froze to death in a single night. Beyond the obvious human tragedy, these were soldiers that couldn't be replaced, since the Swedish army was standing deep in enemy territory. So it was a severely weakened Swedish army that met the spring of 1709 when it eventually arrived. Half of the men who'd crossed into Russia 2 years before had died, and they hadn't even encountered the Russian main army yet. King Karl took what was left of his army and marched it southeast to the fortress at Poltava in Ukraine. It was an important trading hub, but perhaps more importantly, it held a major military depot that the Swedes hoped to loot in order to restock on arms and ammunition. The Swedes reached Poltava in early May 1709 and initiated a siege. In response, Tsar Peter led his army south to face the Swedes. Peter's army numbered almost 80,000 men, 4 times as big as the Swedish army. But when they arrived, the Russians didn't immediately march on the Swedish enemy outside Poltava. Instead, Peter ordered the construction of a fortified camp on the Vorskla River, some 4 kilometers north of the town. Between this camp and the Swedish positions was sort of a corridor flanked by forests on both sides. The Russians built 6 fortified positions across this corridor, and then an additional 4 smaller redoubts perpendicular to that line, creating a T-shape, sort of, with a pointy end sticking out in the direction of the Swedes. This meant that if King Karl wanted to attack the Russian camp, which of course he wanted, he would have to divide his already smallish army into 2 parts, and while they would be marching toward the line of fortifications, Russian soldiers would be firing at them from these redoubts the whole time. On June 20th, the King of Sweden was observing the construction of this Russian defensive T in the middle of the corridor when he was shot in the foot by a stray bullet. The wound wasn't life-threatening or anything like that sort, but it was serious enough that he couldn't walk or ride a horse. Despite not being able to lead the battle from the front as he used to, the king decided it was time to attack the Russians before they had the opportunity to dig themselves in even further. He appointed Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Reinscheld operational commander during the coming battle, while the king himself would be carried around in a litter, trying to get as close to the action as he could. By the way, Reinscheld means reindeer shield, for those of you at home keeping track of funny names of Swedish aristocrats. In the night between July 7th and 8th, the Swedes made the last preparations for battle. At that point, the Russians still hadn't completed the work on the 2 last redoubts, but the completed 8 held 4,000 soldiers. In addition, they were backed up by 10,000 Russian cavalrymen stationed behind the fortified line. The Swedish plan was to try and bypass the 4 redoubts, running along the length of the corridor as quickly as possible and focus on taking the fortified line. To accomplish this, they needed the element of surprise and arranged themselves in attack columns that would advance under the cover of darkness. The infantry was ready to march by 2:30 in the morning, but they had to wait for the cavalry because they got lost in the dark. That wasted a lot of valuable time, and to make matters worse, the Russians discovered a Swedish scout and sounded the alarm. The element of surprise was lost, but the darkness would still protect the Swedes if they could just get going already. But Reinscheld hesitated. He consulted with the king and with Levenhaupt, asking whether it might not be preferable to abort the attack since the Russians now knew they were coming. True to form, the king rejected this idea. He wanted to attack, immediately. So Reinscheld had to go ahead. But by now, even more precious time had been wasted, and it was almost 4 o'clock, and dawn was fast approaching this July morning. In the pale light of the dawn, the battle began. The Swedes advanced and managed to capture the first 2 redoubts fairly easily, but the attack on the third one failed. The Russians managed to hold their positions, halting the Swedish onslaught, at least for a while. Levenhaupt, who was operating to the right of the redoubts, chose to bypass them altogether. His focus was on the fortified line that blocked the passage to the Russian camp. The cavalry on the left followed Levenhaupt's example, and they managed to chase off the Russian cavalry. By now, it was 5 o'clock in the morning, the Swedes had reached the fortified line, and the Russian cavalry was in retreat. Things looked pretty good for the Swedes, all things considered. But then Reinscheld ordered the army to halt, and the cavalry to abort its pursuit of the retreating Russians. About 1/3 of the Swedish army was still bogged down in the attempts to take that 3rd Russian redoubt, and Reinscheld feared that without them, he wouldn't have the manpower needed to advance. His reasoning was sound, but during the 2 hours it took the Swedes to capture the last redoubt, the remaining Russian army had plenty of time to regroup and prepare a counterattack. The Russians didn't waste any time and managed to recapture 2 of the fortified positions, and at 7 o'clock they attacked at 2 points, forcing some Swedish units to retreat. The retreating Swedes tried to return to the siege camp at Poltava, but didn't make it. Instead, they took refuge in an abandoned fort, but by 9:30 they had to surrender. At the same time, the bulk of the Swedish army was faced with Tsar Peter and a force of 22,000 soldiers. That was more than 5 times as many men as the Swedes had left. The enormous Russian army advanced slowly in the heat, through the dust and smoke from the cannons. Despite their numerical disadvantage, Reinscheld ordered the Swedes to attack the Russians head-on at around 9:45 in the morning. When the Swedes were 50 meters from the Russian line, the Russians opened fire. The Swedes moved forward 20 meters more before answering the fire from their own muskets. Then they charged. The first Russian line wavered and started to fall back toward the second line. Again, the Swedes were at the verge of a breakthrough. This was a golden opportunity for the Swedish cavalry to drive home the advantage. Unfortunately for the Swedes, their cavalry wasn't ready, so the Russians managed to stabilize their line. At the same time, the superior numbers on the Russian side started to show. The Swedish left flank was overwhelmed by the much longer Russian line and had to surrender, even though the right flank was still advancing. A gap between the two flanks opened up, and the Russians soon filled it. That was the point when the battle definitely turned against the Swedes. They still tried to advance on the right flank, but Russian cavalry soon swarmed around them and attacked them from the rear. After that, it didn't take long for the Swedish units to disintegrate completely. Here and there, small groups of soldiers managed to escape into the forest, but the vast majority of the Swedes were either killed or captured. At this point, the king realized that the battle was lost, and that he'd be in a lot of trouble if he remained on the battlefield. So he ordered his retinue to escape into the forest as well. Around noon, King Karl, together with a small force of soldiers, emerged from the forest. They moved south as quickly as they could, reaching the baggage train at around 1 o'clock. By that time, the Battle of Poltava was over. The Swedes had lost. Field Marshal Reinfeldt was taken prisoner, and he was far from the only senior Swedish officer to fall into Russian hands that day. Tsar Peter was in a jubilant mood, and he celebrated his great victory by holding a feast in 2 large tents right there on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the King of Sweden had a less pleasant evening. He gathered what was left of his army, and around 7 o'clock in the evening he set off south, away from the celebrating Russians. The goal was to reach the river Dnieper and cross it before the Russians would catch up with them. The Swedish army and their Cossack allies moved as quickly as they could through the night, but the following morning, when they approached the river, the Swedes got a nasty surprise. A Russian force of some 9,000 men was waiting for them, blocking their escape. The Swedes didn't stand a chance to get their men across the river now. They were trapped. Levenhaupt, who led the retreat, sent envoys to negotiate for a truce, but he understood that in the end he'd have no other choice than to surrender. But before he did, he wanted to make sure that at least King Karl would manage to escape the Russians. Together with the other remaining senior officers, Levenhaupt managed to convince the king that he needed to save himself. That night, the king, a couple of thousand soldiers, together with staff and members of the royal household, managed to sneak across the Dnieper. Karl XII was among the last to cross. He reached the far bank of the river at about 9:45 the following morning, continuing south as far away from the Russians as they could get. A little more than an hour later, when he was satisfied that the king had managed to escape, Levenhaupt surrendered to the Russians. The capitulation meant that virtually the whole Swedish army was now gone. The surviving soldiers were taken prisoner, and many were sent to Siberia. Most of them would die there. That fate also befell General Levenhaupt. He would die 10 years later, still in Russian captivity. The Cossacks who had fought with the Swedes weren't even taken prisoner. Any Cossack who hadn't made it across the Dnieper was executed on the spot by the Russians. The complete annihilation of the Swedish main army obviously meant the end of the campaign in Russia, but it had serious consequences elsewhere as well. For one thing, a serious weakness in the allotment system became painfully obvious. It would be quite a challenge to raise a new army using the current system, and there was no money to start a massive hiring campaign of mercenaries. Up until that July morning, 1709, Sweden had been able to fight off its enemies and even flex its muscles in Poland and Saxony. As a result, both Denmark and Poland had abandoned the anti-Swedish alliance and sued for peace. But now, when the Swedes were down, things changed dramatically. Not only did the news of the catastrophic defeat of the Swedish army at Poltava revive the original anti-Swedish alliance, it even broadened it. You may remember that in the last episode, Prussia signed a treaty with Sweden after the defeat of Augustus the Strong. But it turned out the Prussians didn't do so out of love of Sweden, but rather out of strategical considerations. Now, the Prussians saw their chance and turned against the Swedes. Frederick William I, the Elector of Brandenburg and, since 1701, King of Prussia, hoped declaring war on Sweden would mean that he'd be able to conquer the estuary of the river Oder with the access to the Baltic Sea. This had been a long-term strategic goal for Brandenburg for generations, and now they finally had their chance. Also, the Elector of Hanover, George, soon to be King George I of Great Britain and Ireland, drew the conclusion that he'd be able to exploit Sweden's weakness to expand the territory of his principality. Hanover was small and landlocked, and George hoped that joining the war against Sweden would mean he'd be able to gobble up some land that would give him access to the North Sea. But as annoying as the Prussians and the Hanoverians were, they weren't the biggest problem for Sweden. Because in the wake of the military catastrophe at Poltava, both the Danes and the Russians launched invasions of Sweden proper. In Copenhagen, the news about the Swedish defeat at Poltava was greeted with glee and great enthusiasm. This was the chance the Danes had been waiting for. The time was ripe to finally reclaim Scania, Halland and Blekinge from Sweden. King Frederick IV ordered an army to be assembled and sent across the Øresund Strait to take back the eastern provinces. War was officially declared in mid-October, and soon after that 15,000 Danish soldiers were shipped across the Øresund. They landed just south of Helsingborg on November 2nd, and they met with virtually no resistance, because the local Swedish commander, General Magnus Stenbock, only had one single regiment at his disposal in all of Scania. Stenbock retreated north to Småland, where he ordered the hurried assembly of a new army. That winter, he wasted no time gathering new recruits and did what he could to turn them into soldiers before the campaign season would begin again in spring. Meanwhile, the Danes fanned out across Scania. Within a month, they had taken control over the whole province, with the exception of the fortified cities of Landskrona and Malmö. The next step in the Danish plan was to march east into Blekinge and to capture Karlskrona, the naval base established by Karl XI. If the Danes would succeed at that, the Swedish fleet would have to retreat much further into the Baltic Sea, thereby protecting Danish waters and complicating Swedish troop movements. In January 1710, a small Swedish force tried to oppose the approaching Danes outside the town of Kristianstad in northeastern Scania, but the Danish army defeated them easily. The road to Karlskrona now lay open, unless Stenbock could get his army ready on time. Hearing about this, Stenbock realized he couldn't wait until spring. Time was running out, so he set off from Småland and returned to Scania already in early February. There, he linked up with a few more units and could now command some 14,000 men. That meant that the Swedish and the Danish armies were roughly the same size. But the Danish troops were actual soldiers with proper training, whereas the vast majority of the Swedes had been civilians 12 weeks earlier. Stenbock decided not to attack the Danish army head-on. Instead, he planned to march on Helsingborg. The city was the key to the Danish invasion, and if he managed to take it, or at least put it under siege, he'd cut off the Danish supply lines. When the Danes realized what he was up to, they put a pin in the plan to capture Karlskrona, turned the army around, and chased after the Swedes. A race to Helsingborg started, with both the Swedes and the Danes trying to reach the city first. The Swedes won, and Stenbock could block the Danes from entering the city by forcing them to fight. In the early morning of March 10th, according to the Gregorian calendar, Stenbock ordered his troops to prepare for battle. The Danes did the same. A thick fog covered the area, and when it finally lifted, the Danish commander saw to his horror that he'd placed his army in a way so that the Swedes could easily outflank them on the left. Reserves were dispatched to extend the exposed flank as quickly as possible. But Stenbock, who must have seen the same thing, didn't exploit this Danish weakness. Instead, he focused his initial attack on the Danish right flank. The Danes assumed Stenbock had some ace up his sleeve and that he was going to encircle the right flank, so they moved even further to the right to avoid what they thought was a Swedish trap. But that opened up a gap between the two Danish flanks, and now they didn't have reserves to fill it, because they'd already been sent to assist the left flank when the fog lifted. The fighting started on the right flank, and even though the Danes managed to repel the first Swedish attack, the Swedes continued to press on. The Danish commander participated personally in the fighting. It was brave but risky, and sure enough, he was shot and wounded in the lung. He didn't die, but he was in no condition to continue leading the battle. At about the same time as their commander had been evacuated from the battlefield, a rumor started to spread among the Danish soldiers that the Swedes had managed to encircle the right flank and were about to attack them from behind. This caused panic, and the Danish lines disintegrated when the troops started to flee back toward the safety of Helsingborg. When the soldiers in the Danish center saw their right flank melting away, they too lost courage and started to falter. It didn't take long for the new Danish commander to order the army to retreat to Helsingborg and to take up positions behind the city walls. It was a severely reduced Danish army that found refuge in the city that evening. About half of their men were either dead, wounded, or captured. Stenbock had won the battle, but not the war. He knew he didn't have the resources to take Helsingborg by storm. Instead, he encircled the city and sent the Danes an offer to surrender. When the offer was refused, the Swedish commander ordered his artillery to start firing at the city. The bombardment went on for a few days before the Danes admitted to themselves that their situation was untenable. But instead of surrendering, they decided to evacuate the troops and retreat across the Öresund, which they did. That way, they saved the remainder of the army from falling into Swedish captivity, but they weren't able to bring their horses or artillery with them. They didn't want to leave the animals and the cannons for the Swedes though, so the horses were slaughtered and the cannons were sabotaged. Then the remaining Danish soldiers were shipped back across the Öresund. The attempt to take back Scania had failed, yet again. Magnus Stenbock was hailed as a hero after his victory at Helsingborg, but the city itself had suffered greatly. Not only had many buildings sustained heavy damage during the Swedish bombardment, but the horse cadavers soon started to spread disease. It didn't help that a plague epidemic flared up, killing even more of the inhabitants. It would take generations for Helsingborg to recover from the ordeal. At the same time as Stenbock was busy defending Scania from the Danish invasion, Tsar Peter was rolling up the Swedish Empire east of the Baltic Sea. In 1710, the Russians managed to take Riga, which was the largest city in the Swedish Baltic provinces. So losing it and all its trade and tax revenue was a blow to the Swedish crown. And it didn't end there. Soon, all of Livonia, Courland and Estonia had fallen into Russian hands. With the loss of the Baltic provinces, Sweden's time as the dominant power in the Baltic Sea was definitely over. That role had been taken over by the Russians. Tsar Peter's empire was in ascendance, and the breakthrough to the Baltic Sea would turn out to be the first stepping stone toward growing Russian influence and further conquests in Eastern Europe. But Peter the Great wasn't happy with merely taking the Swedish provinces east of the Baltic Sea. He decided to continue to press on into Finland. The period of Russian occupation of Finland in the early 1700s is known as the Great Wrath, and I guess the name tells you all you really need to know about what it was like. Much like Scania, Finland was left more or less defenseless after the catastrophe at Poltava. The Russians knew it, and just like the Danes, they didn't hesitate to exploit the situation. In 1712, the Russians made the first attempt at occupying Finland, but they were pushed back. But already the following year, they returned, and after winning a battle in the vicinity of Helsinki, they forced the Swedes to retreat from the southern coastal region. The Russians pushed on, and in February 1714, they won another battle close to the village of Isokyrö, east of the port city of Vasa, on the Gulf of Bothnia. When the Swedes also failed at their attempt to stop the Russian fleet at Hanko, where the Gulf of Finland meets the Baltic Sea, Russian warships could push deep into Swedish waters, ferrying troops across to Sweden proper. Now the Swedes had lost de facto control of Finland. The Russians had occupied the whole country, and after the victory at the Battle of Isokyrö, Tsar Peter appointed a governor of Finland, clearly showing that as far as he was concerned, the Russian presence there was going to become permanent. He also ordered a several 100-kilometer broad swath of northern Ostrobothnia to be completely destroyed, burning everything, making sure that the Swedish army wouldn't be able to return to Finland over land. If the Swedes would try to march around the Gulf of Bothnia to the north to recapture Finland, they'd find themselves in this desolated death zone, unable to sustain themselves. After the withdrawal of the Swedish army, The Finnish civilians were at the mercy of the Russian occupiers. And unfortunately, there wasn't much mercy to be had. The peasants were squeezed for as much money and other resources as possible. In addition to the forced tribute, plundering was also widespread, as was torture, rapes, and killings. There are plenty of reports of atrocities. For example, 800 unarmed civilians were massacred by axe-wielding Cossacks on the island of Hailuoto in the north of the Gulf of Bothnia. In nearby Rahe, local peasants were slaughtered at the market square. In Porvoo, the mutilated corpses of murdered locals were displayed. The list of similar atrocities goes on and on. Property was also targeted. Many churches were plundered and villages burned to the ground. The Russians would often only spare buildings used to house their own troops, leaving the surviving peasants to fend for themselves as best they could. Thousands of Finns fled across the Gulf of Bothnia to Sweden, and many of those who didn't live in the coastal region chose to hide in the deep Finnish forests to try and escape the brutality of the Russian occupiers. When peace finally returned, approximately a quarter of all farms in Finland were abandoned or destroyed. We don't know how many Finns were killed during the Great Wrath. Estimates vary from 5,000 to 20,000. In addition to those killed, tens of thousands of Finns were abducted by the Russians. Between 10 and 20,000 Finns were forced to work as slave laborers, building Tsar Peter's new capital, St. Petersburg. Some 2,000 were forced to join the Russian army. In addition, thousands of Finnish women and children were kidnapped and trafficked at slave markets in the Middle East, where the exotic blonde Finns fetched a high price. The Swedish ambassador in Constantinople reported to have bought the freedom of many Finnish women at the slave market in the city. But where was the king when all of this was happening to his subjects? Tune in next time when we'll trace the footsteps of Karl XII as he escaped the Russians after the disaster at Poltava. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word among your friends who'd also enjoy hearing about the unraveling of the Swedish Empire? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show in social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.